Navy submarines of World War II has been found. The USS Harder was sunk in a battle on August 24, 1944, as the U.S. sought to retake the Philippines from occupying Japanese forces.
Imagine a 1,600-ton steel shark that didn't just hide, it hunted. In 1945, most submarines were sluggish diving bells that spent their lives gasping for air on the surface. Then came the Type 21. It was a silent underwater predator so fast it could literally outrun the world's deadliest torpedoes. This wasn't just a boat. It was a terrifying leap into the future that arrived a second too late to win the war, but changed naval combat forever. The Iron Coffin. To truly appreciate the Type 21, you first have to realize that up until 1944, submarines were essentially a massive technical lie. In reality, they weren't true undersea craft. They were just grumpy, narrow surface ships that could occasionally hold their breath. The standard German workhorse, the Type 7, spent about 90% of its life on the surface because it was powered by massive diesel engines that required a constant, greedy gulp of oxygen to function. Going underwater was never the preferred state of being. It was a desperate, temporary tactic used to hide or ambush. Once submerged, these boats relied on lead-acid batteries that were, frankly, pathetic. They moved at a crawling pace of roughly 7 knots if they pushed the motors to the limit, which is barely faster than a brisk walk. If a British destroyer spotted you on the horizon, you were essentially a metal turtle trying to outrun a cheetah in a tracksuit. Living in these boats was a waking nightmare of claustrophobia and chemical stench. Imagine 50 men crammed into a pressurized steel tube the size of a school bus, surrounded by the overwhelming aroma of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and rotting cabbage. There was no air conditioning, no privacy, and usually only one working toilet because the other head was used as a pantry for extra rations. But the real terror wasn't the smell. It was the ASDIC, early sonar. Once the Royal Navy pinned your location, you were stuck in a horrific game of slow-motion target practice. You would sit in total silence, dripping with cold sweat as the hull creaked under the pressure, praying the next depth charge didn't turn your ribs into shrapnel. You couldn't move fast enough to escape the blast radius. By 1943, the Atlantic had become a vast, cold graveyard for these iron coffins, and the U-boat crews knew they were essentially dead men walking on water. But to understand why the next boat was a spaceship, you have to understand how they finally learned to stop breathing. The Eureka moment. The German Navy realized they were losing the war not because of a lack of courage, but because of a lack of oxygen. The Atlantic had become a slaughterhouse. If a U-boat stayed on the surface to charge its batteries, a Liberator bomber would spot its wake and drop a payload of depth charges before the crew could even clear the bridge. If it stayed underwater, it was a blind, limping target. They needed a radical departure from traditional naval architecture. They didn't need a boat that could submerge. They needed a true submarine, a vessel that belonged to the deep. This shift in thinking was spearheaded by the brilliant, if somewhat eccentric, engineer Helmuth Walter. Walter was obsessed with speed and specialized in high-test peroxide, HTP, propulsion. His goal was to create a closed-cycle engine that didn't need atmospheric oxygen at all, allowing a boat to sprint underwater at speeds that would make a destroyer's head spin. However, Walter's HTP turbines were complex, volatile, and to be blunt, prone to exploding. The Kriegsmarine needed a solution they could actually build before their entire fleet ended up at the bottom of the ocean. This led to the Eureka moment in 1943 during a series of frantic design meetings. If the HTP engine wasn't ready for prime time, why not take the sleek, aerodynamic hull Walter had designed and stuff it full of the most massive battery array ever conceived? The designers realized that by streamlining the hull, removing the clunky deck guns and the jagged protrusions that caused drag, they could maximize the efficiency of electric motors. They moved away from the traditional V-shaped hull of a surface ship and toward a rounded figure-8 cross-section. This allowed for a massive lower deck, dedicated entirely to batteries. It was a paradigm shift. The boat was no longer designed to ride the waves. It was shaped like a wing to fly through the water. This was the birth of the electroboat, a design so revolutionary that it bypassed decades of incremental naval evolution in a single leap. The Germans didn't just want a faster engine, they wanted to rewrite the laws of naval physics. The spec sheet. Walking inside a Type 21 for the first time was like stepping off a horse and carriage and onto the bridge of the USS Enterprise. Everything about the boat's interior screamed future. The Germans had ditched the cramped, chaotic layouts of the past for a design that prioritized automation and lethal efficiency. To start with, they solved the oxygen problem with the schnorkel, a retractable breathing tube covered in radar-absorbent material. This allowed the boat to run its heavy diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, charging its massive battery banks without exposing itself to Allied radar. It was the ultimate hide-and-seek cheat code. But the real magic was happening in the lower half of the hull, where the designers had crammed 33 blocks of 372 individual battery cells. This gave the Type 21 triple the battery capacity of any previous submarine, allowing it to stay submerged for several days at a time or sprint at high speeds for hours on end without ever needing to see the sun. Then there was the weapon system, which was pure science fiction for 1944. On a standard U-boat, reloading a torpedo tube was a grueling, manual labor process that took between 10 and 20 minutes of sweating, cursing, and heavy lifting. If you missed your first shot, you were usually a sitting duck before you could get a second one off. The Type 21 changed the game with a revolutionary hydraulic semi-automatic loading system. It could reload all 6 of its bow tubes in just under 4 minutes. In the time it took an enemy destroyer to realize it had been fired upon, the Type 21 could have a second and third salvo already in the water. It also featured a sophisticated creep motor, an extra electric motor specifically designed for silent running. This allowed the boat to glide past enemy sonar pickets at 5 knots while making less noise than a school of fish. The navigation and detection suites were equally mind-blowing. The boat was equipped with SU radar and a highly advanced passive sonar array known as the balcongerette. This balcony of hydrophones located in the keel allowed the crew to detect and track individual ships from miles away while staying deep underwater. They could even calculate a firing solution without ever raising the periscope, meaning the target would never see the eye of the hunter watching them. Even the crew's quality of life saw an upgrade. The boat featured air purification systems, a freezer for fresh food, and even a show. Luxuries that were unheard of in the old iron coffins. It was a pressurized, automated, and highly comfortable killing machine that made the entire Allied anti-submarine doctrine look like it belonged in the Napoleonic Wars. Every bolt and wire was designed for one singular purpose: to vanish from the surface and dominate the depths. It was a masterpiece of engineering, built by a country that was currently turning into a pile of rubble. Outrunning death.
The submarine, which had the motto of "hit 'em harder," went down along with the entire crew of 79 men.
To understand why the Type 21 sent a shiver down the spine of every Allied admiral, you have to look at the terrifying math of naval pursuit. In the early 40s, a submarine's greatest fear was the escort, the destroyers and corvettes that circled convoys like sheepdogs. These ships were designed to be faster than anything underwater. If a standard U-boat was caught, its only hope was to dive deep, sit still, and pray. But the Type 21 didn't pray, it accelerated. Thanks to its streamlined alberic skin and those massive battery banks, the 21 could hit a submerged speed of 17 knots. To the uninitiated, that sounds like a leisurely Saturday drive. But in the viscous, high-pressure environment of the deep ocean, 17 knots was a blistering, unheard-of pace. It was actually faster than its own surfaced speed, making it the first true submarine in history. This speed changed the fundamental physics of survival. Most Allied acoustic torpedoes of the era, like the American Mark 24 Fido, were designed to home in on the sound of a submarine's propellers. However, these early smart torpedoes had a significant limitation. They weren't much faster than the targets they were hunting. When a Type 21 opened up its electric motors to full power, It could maintain a pace that made it nearly impossible for a homing torpedo to close the distance before running out of fuel. It was like a track star outrunning a toddler. The torpedo could see the target, but it just couldn't catch it.
Plagued by the German inability to cope with the wartime stresses and the classic disease of being too little too late.
Even more impressive was the boat's ability to maintain high speeds for extended periods. While an old-school sub would drain its batteries in minutes during a high-speed dash, the 21 could maintain a sprint for over an hour, or cruise at 12 knots for 5 hours straight. This maneuverability meant the Type 21 could do something no other sub could. It could outrun the sonar cone of an attacking ship. Typically, a destroyer had to slow down to listen for a submarine. If the destroyer sped up to attack, it became blinded by the noise of its own wake. The Type 21 exploited this gap perfectly. By the time a destroyer captain had coordinated a depth charge drop, the 21 was already half a mile away, lurking in a different sector entirely. It turned the hunter into the bewildered prey. For the first time in the war, the Germans had a vessel that could dictate the terms of the engagement, escaping a guaranteed kill through raw mechanical power. The only problem was that building a spaceship is a lot harder when your factories are being turned into craters. The prefab gamble. By 1944, Germany was losing the war of attrition, and their shipyards were constant targets for Allied 1,000-bomber raids. Traditional submarine construction was a slow, meticulous process, where a boat was built from the keel up in a single slipway. This made them sitting ducks. To get the Type 21 into the water before the Reich collapsed, Armaments Minister Albert Speer spearheaded a radical, desperate manufacturing shift: modular construction. The plan was to build the Type 21 in 8 massive prefabricated sections at 32 different inland factories, far away from the coastal bombs. These sections would then be transported by canal and rail to massive reinforced concrete bunkers like Valentin in Bremen, where they would be welded together like a lethal set of Legos. This was the first time assembly line techniques had been applied to a machine as complex as a submarine. On paper, it was a stroke of genius. It meant that even if a bomb destroyed a shipyard, the factories making the engines, batteries, or bow sections were still churning out parts. In theory, this would allow Germany to produce an astonishing 33 Type 21s every single month. However, reality was much messier than Speer's spreadsheets. The inland factories were staffed by forced laborers and lacked the precision of seasoned naval shipwrights. When the sections finally arrived at the assembly bunkers, they often didn't fit together. Gaps of several centimeters had to be hammered, welded, or shimmed into place, which compromised the structural integrity of the hulls. Moreover, the logistics were a nightmare. Moving a 150-ton middle section of a submarine across a war-torn country required a miracle of transportation. Allied air superiority meant that the rail lines and canals were constantly being severed. A boat might be finished, except for Section 3, which was currently sitting on a derailed train in the Black Forest. Despite these hurdles, the Germans managed to launch 118 boats. But the rush to produce them meant they were riddled with teething problems. Hydraulic leaks, faulty wiring, and structural weaknesses turned many of these revolutionary boats into harbor-bound headaches rather than Atlantic terrors. The prefab gamble proved that while you can mass-produce a car, you can't easily mass-produce a revolution while the world is falling down around you. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was being built in a burning house. Too little, too late.
According to the Navy's History and Heritage Command, the USS Harder was found sitting upright and mostly intact 3,000 feet down in the South China Sea.
On April 30th, 1945, U-2 511 slipped out of Bergen, Norway, commanded by Adalbert Schnee. This was the moment of truth. For years, the Allies had dominated the waves with high-tech radar and relentless air patrols. But Schnee was about to prove that the Type 21 changed the rules. While submerged, he encountered a British cruiser escorted by several destroyers. In any other boat, this would have been a suicide mission. Instead, Schnee used the 21's silent creep motors to slide right under the escort screen undetected. He tracked the cruiser, moved into a perfect firing position, and realized he had the kill locked in. He didn't fire. The war was ending, and he had orders to cease hostilities, but he had proven the point. He slipped away without the British ever knowing he was there. It was a terrifying glimpse of what might have happened if the 21 had arrived just 18 months earlier. Despite the engineering brilliance, the Type 21 was a strategic ghost. Out of the 118 boats built, U-2511 was the only one to ever conduct a full combat patrol. The rest were stuck in a limbo of mechanical failures, lack of trained crews, and a collapsing supply chain. The German Navy had the ultimate weapon, but they had no fuel to run it and no safe harbors to keep it in. Allied bombers had moved from attacking the boats to attacking the infrastructure itself, burying the massive assembly bunkers under tall-boy earthquake bombs. The crews, once the elite of the German military, were being used as makeshift infantry in the streets of Berlin, while their high-tech submarines sat idle in the Baltic. The tragedy of the Type 21, at least from a purely technical perspective, was its timing. It was a 50s weapon fighting a 40s war. By the time the teething problems were being ironed out, the Red Army was miles from the assembly plants. The Germans had spent millions of Reichsmarks and countless lives developing a machine that was essentially a miracle of science, only to watch it become a series of expensive reef additions or scrap metal. It was the ultimate wonder weapon that did absolutely nothing to change the outcome of the war, serving only as a grim reminder that even the best technology is useless if you don't have a functional country to support it. The war was over, but the Type 21 story was just getting started under new management. The silent legacy
was sunk in a battle on August 24, 1944, as the U.S. sought to retake the Philippines from occupying Japanese forces.
When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Allies didn't just want the territory, they wanted the blueprints. British, American, and Soviet intelligence teams scrambled to seize as many Type 21 boats as possible, treating them like captured alien technology. They weren't interested in the old Type 7s, those were scrap metal. They wanted the electro boats. The United States hauled 2 of them back across the Atlantic in an operation that looked more like a high-stakes heist than a military transfer. They poked, prodded, and stress-tested every weld and wire. What they found changed the trajectory of the Cold War. The US Navy realized that their entire fleet was obsolete, leading directly to the Guppy, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program project. This program took existing American subs and essentially Frankensteined them with Type 21 features, streamlining the hulls, removing deck guns, and doubling the battery capacity to mimic the German design. The Soviets were even more aggressive. They didn't just take the boats, they dismantled entire factories and shipped them east. The Soviet Whiskey-class submarine, which became the backbone of their early Cold War fleet, was a direct, unapologetic descendant of the Type 21. For decades, the looming threat of the Soviet submarine force was built on the foundation laid by Helmuth Walter and his team of German engineers. Even the world's first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, owed its hydrodynamic DNA to the Type 21. While the nuclear reactor provided the infinite breath the Germans had dreamed of, the hull that contained it was shaped by the lessons learned in the assembly bunkers of Bremen. Today, only one Type 21 remains, the Wilhelm Bauer, sitting as a museum ship in Bremerhaven. It serves as a haunting, silent monument to a design that was decades ahead of its time. It represents a terrifying what-if in military history. If the war had lasted another year, the Atlantic might have become an impassable barrier once again. Instead, the Type 21 became the ancestor of every modern submarine patrolling the oceans today. It didn't win the war for the Third Reich, but it redefined naval warfare for the rest of the century. The electroboat proved that in the dark, silent reaches of the deep, speed and stealth are the only currencies that matter. The machine was finally perfected, but the world it was built to conquer had already moved on. Type 21 was a paradox of engineering, a brilliant solution to a war that was already lost. It remains a chilling reminder that technical superiority doesn't exist in a vacuum. While it never got the chance to terrorize the Atlantic, its streamlined ghost still haunts the design of every modern submarine currently lurking in the deep. It was the future of naval warfare, delivered just a heartbeat too late. If you want more deep dives into the machines that changed history, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started.